Good afternoon. We're going to get started here. I apologize for the lateness. Our subject today is Surfing for Secrets, Cyber Insecurity in the Digital Age. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of ways we could have gone given that title. The instructions that I gave these panelists was that I thought we should focus on the tension between security and liberty, obviously focusing in the cyber realm. There's been a lot of current events lately that have touched on those subjects, and I have to tell you, I work at the Heritage Foundation. I'm one of their directors there. My name's Steve Bucci. And Senator, right here? Nope. And this is an area that, frankly, conservatives have a lot of trouble with. And the reason we have a lot of trouble with it is that we care deeply for security. We want to give the men and women who protect us all the tools they need to do so. But we also care very deeply for our constitutionally protected liberties and rights as citizens. Well, this area kind of puts that tension in stark relief. We've gathered a panel here today that is going to touch on these issues, to discuss it briefly. I've originally asked all the panelists to speak for 10 minutes. I've asked them to squeeze that as much as possible because there's 5 of them. And so we can get to some of your questions as well, because in my experience, cyber brings out the questions from the American people. And unfortunately, our government doesn't do enough to answer those questions. So we're going to try and help with that today. Sitting on the panel and speaking first is Mr. John Solomon. John is the editor and vice president for content and business development for the Washington Times. He has worked as a journalist since the mid-'80s, a myriad of different organizations, and he left the Times. He started another organization called the Washington Guardian, an online vehicle, and is now back with the Times. And he covers these kind of issues. He's going to be followed by Kevin Freeman. Kevin is the founder and CEO of Cross Consulting and Services and several other investment and advisory services, but he is known as one of the authorities in our country on economic warfare, which nowadays happens primarily over the digital media. He will be followed by Senator Rob Portman, who is the senator from Ohio. Senator Portman was also a congressman from Southern Ohio and served as the United States Trade Representative and the director of the Office of Management and Budget. And now, as I say, he's a sitting senator and is on several committees that deal with these issues. And then the last full opening remarks are going to come from Congressman Mike Pompeo. He is, and I have to say this because he's a graduate of the United States Military Academy, as am I. I did okay. He did really well. He graduated #1 in his class. Served for several years on the border with the Soviet Union. Just as that collapsed, he went back, got his law degree, started a couple of businesses, the one I noticed called Thayer, which is a reference back to West Point as well, and is now sitting on several key committees in the House. And then to round it out at the end, when we go to the Q&A, we also have Michael Mukasey, the former Attorney General of the United States, one of my personal heroes, because there are very few people in the United States that can speak about these kind of issues as clearly and authoritatively, and I understand it. So I can't say that about every lawyer that's out there. So it's very, very powerful. So with that, we'll start with John.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here and great to be in such great company. My introduction to cyber privacy came as a reporter in 2001 and 2002. I had done some investigative stories, and suddenly I received a subpoena from the FBI for my phone records at home, and then later had my mail intercepted coming from the Philippines, and I had no idea how they knew to find one individual FedEx package from the Philippines that was coming to me on a story about what had happened after 9/11. And it took a long time to dig into that, but I learned that I was picked up on an intercept overseas, talking to a foreign country about a document that was publicly available, actually. And somehow the FBI managed to get that document, seize it at the border, never obtain it through a warrant, and hold on to it, and actually instruct FedEx to tell me that it had fallen off a truck in the Philippines. We eventually figured out what happened, and I began to realize that this is a much more complicated world. As a First Amendment, a person in the First Amendment profession, and we've now watched over the last decade the NSA program and all the things that have been debated in public, and there are far smarter people than I to talk about that today. So I'm going to steer you in a slightly different direction, because as I've moved up into an editor's role at the Washington Times, I see almost on a daily basis now people probing our internet system and trying to break into our stories, try to take over our internet, hijack, put terrible messages on there, and we spend most of our technological time trying to repel this extraordinary army of cyber terrorists, cyber vandalists, cyber criminals. And so I'd like to tell you about a special night back in 2012. I was covering the second debate between Mr. Romney and the President Obama, and I got a call and they said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm in the middle of watching the debate, trying to write a lead." And he said, "Go flip your internet channel and go to this little speech in New York. No one knows about it. You have to go watch this." And I listened obediently, and there was then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, and he gave a speech at the New York Economic Club that caught my ear for sure. He talked about the not-so-distant future that we would experience a cyber Pearl Harbor. I had no idea what that meant, but I got a better sense of it today after presiding over a newspaper that has constant now efforts at trying to penetrate its digital assets. And I wrote a quick story, and that term sort of went across the internet. Drudge picked it up, and it just sort of took a life all of its own. Since the day of that speech, I've pointed our reporters towards trying to understand, what is this world going to be like? What are the people in Congress going to have to legislate against? What are the people in law enforcement and national security apparatuses going to have to do to protect us? And I'll share a couple statistics that I'm just amazed by. It's only been 2 years since Secretary Panetta gave that speech. There have been a quarter billion credit cards that have been compromised since he gave that speech. We've known some of them, 90 million at a company called TJX, 56 million at Home Depot, 40 million at Target. There are estimates that that number will quadruple in the next 2 years, despite all the investments that people are making. So this is a very real threat, and it affects all of us in our homes and in our places. You go to the ATM, right? You stick your card at the gas station and you slide it through. There are Romanian mob people that spend all day skimming your ATM cards. $1 billion a year, the Secret Service says. You go to put your PIN number in, and there's a camera taking a picture of you putting your PIN number in, and very soon afterwards your ATM card is being spent somewhere in the Middle East or in Europe somewhere. $1 billion there. The cost of fraud is growing in every place, and not only is the loss that you, the consumer, or the company initially loses, there's also a compliance and replacement cost. Every dollar lost to fraud, cyber fraud, results in $3.08 in additional expenditures by company to get right with their customers. So if you lose $5 billion of cyber fraud, which is what the estimate is right now, you spend another $15 billion trying to adjust for it. These are huge numbers that have economic consequences. They have huge consequences for you, your wallet, your privacy. And much of the conversation in Washington today has focused around the NSA and those issues. There's very little conversation in the policy halls today about how to really get on top of this growing threat, because if it's happening to us and our credit cards, it's happening at the Pentagon, very determined enemies, and they have really cool names too. Numbered Panda, Magic Kitten, Energetic Bear, and Dead-Eye Jackal are just a couple of the code names that cyber criminals now have created for large-scale criminal enterprises. And so as we try to protect our privacy and deal with the issues that government and the Congress have to deal with, we have this constant and growing threat, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. So I hope today when we talk a little bit more, we can kind of balance. I think the challenge in the Congress and in the media is to balance the sensationalism of privacy and the concerns that we all worry about in a free nation with liberty, and this extraordinary threat that could one day, as Secretary Panetta said, result in a cyber Pearl Harbor. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I'll turn it back.
Great, thank you. All right, Kevin?
Well, actually, I want to go beyond the fact that it's a potential cyber Pearl Harbor and say it's also a cyber Hiroshima potentially as well. It's the beginning and an end of a war potentially, because this is systemic in nature, the threat we face. In 1999, two senior colonels of the People's Liberation Army wrote a book titled Unrestricted Warfare, a Master Plan to Destroy a Superpower. And in it, they said, a single computer virus invasion can have more impact than a nuclear bomb. They're not alone in this thinking. A man named Fawad Hussein, who's a Pakistani journalist, met with al-Qaeda in 2005 and was interviewed in Der Spiegel magazine. He listed a timeline that al-Qaeda had to create an Islamic State, and he mentioned in there what we would term the Arab Spring, beginning around the year 2010, overthrowing the Arab regimes. So we know they're serious about this timeline because we've seen evidence of it. Beginning in 2013, they talk about economic warfare attacks with electronic attacks against critical infrastructure. The goal being twofold: to collapse the US dollar so US military might collapses, and to reestablish the caliphate by 2020. So that's a part of the al-Qaeda ISIS doctrine. Sergei Glazyev, who's a Putin advisor, said last year that if you put sanctions on Russia, we have the capability of crashing your financial system. This is modern economic warfare, and it's being waged via cyber means. And it has real-world examples. We've seen Sony Pictures was hacked and the threats that came from that. There was a digital bomb placed in the NASDAQ that we uncovered by Russia. Operation Cleaver, which is an Iranian operation, had 50 targets in 16 countries that Silence uncovered, plus the Iranians hacked the Marine Corps database and the Naval database. They're very successful. CENTCOM hacked ISIS hacked CENTCOM's social media and put out tweets and things saying that ISIS was in charge. The Russians, prior to invading Georgia and the Ukraine, conducted serious cyber attacks with real-world impacts. It could be in the form of cyber espionage, cyber blackmail, cyber sabotage, or total war cyber warfare. They have real-world impacts. A good example is the Syrian Electronic Army in the year 2013 hacked the Associated Press Twitter feed and put out a fake tweet that says the White House has been hit and the stock market lost $200 billion in a matter of seconds. Now, it did recover, but we still don't know what happened in May 2010 when the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted almost 10% in a flash crash. Bottom line, it could have been a cyber incident. They are capable. I was with Frank Keating, the former governor of Oklahoma, and Frank is now head of the American Bankers Association, and he met with the Treasury Secretary and two very senior bank executives. And the Treasury Secretary looked at them and said, "What keeps you up at night?" And they said, "Well, we wake up tomorrow morning and find that Jack Lew's money in his account is gone. That scares us. Even worse than that, we might wake up one day and find that all records of Jack Lew's account entirely are gone." General Keith Alexander said on 60 Minutes, yes, a foreign national does have the capability to take down our entire financial system. Admiral Rogers, who's now the head of the NSA, said basically China and others could take down our entire infrastructure, our entire system. So how do we address this? First off, we realize it's very personal. We're not just talking about an attack on an army or military base. We're talking about attacks on your wallets, your credit cards, your bank accounts, your way of life. We recognize, secondly, it's systemic. It could take down the United States permanently. It's asymmetric. Jim Rickards says, for example, if the Russians took down our stock exchange and we retaliated, it would destroy America, but Russia could continue without their stock exchange. And we have very little technological advantage. Kaspersky Labs caught the fact that there are planted codes inside flash drives and Western media and so forth that we've been selling. They're catching up. Our technological advantage in this area is really gone. And we have a real problem because we're relying too much on data collection and manipulation, thinking that's the only means of intelligence. Human intelligence trumps that, as Edward Snowden pointed out, and Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who just retired from the Defense Intelligence Agency, has pointed out that we've kind of given up human intelligence assets overseas just for the digital type. So there are conservative responses and things that we should be doing that will not sacrifice liberty. First off, we need to get our $18 trillion debt under control because this is an economic war that we're fighting, and that makes us more vulnerable. we need a free and open internet, and we need human intelligence overseas. So I would take the idea that cyber Pearl Harbor, and I would take it to also a cyber Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Thank you.
Right. Senator?
Well, thank you. I was in a good mood before I got here today. Seriously, thank you guys very much, John and Kevin, for your work on this and what you told us today. And look, this is an incredibly frightening prospect. And it's right here. It's right now. Everybody in this room has probably been affected one way or another. You may not know it. One thing that we have learned through this, and Attorney General Mukasey is going to talk later, I think, usually you don't find out this stuff happens until, on average, I'm told 200 days after the attack. Is that right? A lot of companies, think they're safe. FBI Director Comey made a statement recently, which was kind of chilling. He said every major U.S. company has been attacked. And in fact, I think he even pointed to the Chinese. And he said some of them know it and some of them don't. So I think we understand the gravity of it. I was with a bunch of community bankers from Ohio yesterday. They come in once a year, for a big meeting on the Hill. And we talked about all the normal issues you'd expect. I'm a big proponent of deregulation in terms of, the overkill and Dodd-Frank. And so we talked about that. They're really getting swept up into regulations they never should have been swept up into. Nothing to do with too big to fail or all that. And then I said, but what are your top issues? And of course it was regulations. You know what the number one issue was after that? Cybersecurity. Because you think about it, we all figured Target took a bath and Home Depot took a bath, and John, you mentioned some other examples of that. You know who else took a bath? The community bankers, right? And so this is affecting our economy in ways that I think is not even being quantified. I've heard numbers. Some people say, it's $100 billion a year. I think what we heard here this morning is just further evidence of the fact that it's broader than that. And it concerns me that our own government is not addressing this as we should. I think it's another example, frankly, where President Obama and his administration are happy to talk about the issue but not address it. What I like to say is they kind of admire a problem, but they don't do the hard work to actually address it. And I would put on that list, by the way, tax reform, since that was talked about in terms of our economy, deficit reduction, since that was just talked about by Kevin, and I agree with him. I would put on there what's happening right now in terms of us trying to get at this issue of cyber attacks and cybersecurity legislation on the Hill. They aren't rolling up their sleeves and getting engaged, and they're just kind of throwing it out there as, oh, here's a problem to admire, but we're not really going to do the hard work. I would put ISIS in that category. And I think you see it on the nightly news every night. So whether it's crafting and leading a coherent foreign policy, dealing with these domestic issues we have, they're just not good at actually finding a solution. And we have to do that, hard as it is. Second, I will tell you, and I don't mean to make you even more depressed today, Capitol Hill's not ready for this. There are 5 different committees. And Congressman, I'm sure you are in the middle of this right now with your committee assignments. I'm on the Homeland Security Committee. You might think that's a committee that has jurisdiction over this. No. It's actually being worked out more in the Intel Committee now, or maybe more in the Judiciary Committee, but also Homeland Security, and frankly, almost every committee has a piece of it, but there are 5 that have jurisdiction, meaning to get legislation passed is much more difficult than it should be. We have to reorganize the structure of government to meet these 21st century challenges, and this is part of what we have to do, I think, to pass good legislation and to make sure we're taking into account all the different aspects of it, because it is very complicated, it's very tough, probably why the administration doesn't want to roll up their sleeves and get involved in it like these other issues are. As complex as it is, I do think we have some solutions we ought to be focused on. One, better job of sharing information about attacks. And I'm talking about primarily business-to-business sharing, because there are certain things, as you'll hear from the experts here, I'm not an expert at this on the technological side, but monitoring computer networks for indicators of past attacks allows organizations to be able to prevent and detect when something happens. These indicators reflect unusual types of attacks. Sometimes they can almost be like fingerprints, where once you identify that, you know you're in trouble. Enabling us to attribute an attack to a particular individual or a group or a state-backed enterprise is something that's very important, but that requires this information sharing. And that gets into trouble sometimes with our antitrust laws and other laws. This is why some of these businesses have said to the United States Congress and to the administration, we need some liability protection to be able to share information, to be able to be effective in stopping some of these cyber terrorists. And again, our 21st century problems are being addressed by a 20th century solution because we do not have the up-to-date antitrust laws to be able to deal with this. So that's one thing we need to do, in my view, is do a better job of providing the framework for better information sharing, particularly among those who are interested in knowing how to deal with these attacks, prevent them and stop them. Second, and this is something that I know sounds kind of common sense, but it's not happening. We need to have more people in government who actually understand this issue and are professionals who are able to deal with it. And why do I say that? It's very difficult to attract these people to government. I passed legislation along with Senator Mike Bennett from Colorado about a year ago on this. It's called the Homeland Security Cybersecurity Workforce Assessment Act. Why did we do this? Because the Department of Homeland Security cybersecurity workforce is not up to the task, in our view. And they have a tough time attracting the right people. So what we were saying is, let's create a uniform classification system. Let's help them identify the problems. Let's provide them more incentives to be able to hire some of the best people. We want the very best from the private sector to be able to help so that our Pentagon, in this case our Homeland Security Department, are not compromised. And it's a real problem to attract these people. I will say I'm excited about the fact that the Ohio National Guard was just given an opportunity to be one of, I don't know, maybe 5 guards around the country to be involved in this issue. And what I'm telling our Ohio National Guard is bring in the experts from Ohio State, from Battelle, which is a great research, largest private research institute in the world, is in Columbus, Ohio. People from the private sector who have expertise. Bring them into the Guard, have them be working on this. It's a great opportunity for the Ohio Guard, expanding their jurisdiction. We got to be sure they have the expertise. So, again, these are frightening statistics we're hearing on the number of attacks, the economic impact, the ability for them to take down, whole systems, infrastructure that's so sensitive and vulnerable. Our Defense Department, we need to get an administration and a Congress better organized to deal with it, better focused on it. And if we do that, I think if we have better information on the depth of the problem, I think we can make some progress. I think this administration has been caught flat-footed many times when these threats arise. Again, I use ISIS as an example, and I think we're once again in that position. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and then hearing your questions, but this is not one that we can ignore. Thank you, Steve.
All right. Congressman?
Great. Thank you. I've got a short clip that I'd like folks to see.
The disclosures that Edward Snowden reveals don't only expose a threat to our privacy, but to our democracy itself. When the most important decisions being made affecting all of us are made in secret, we lose our ability to check the powers that control. Thank you to Edward Snowden for his courage and for the many other whistleblowers. And I share this with Glenn Greenwald and other journalists who are exposing truth. Thank you.
The subject of Citizen4, Edward Snowden, could not be here tonight for some treason.
I thought we'd have a little fun, but just as importantly, that debate that you just saw there, the debate, frankly, amongst the left, there wasn't a conservative in that video. I didn't see any of them here this morning as I walked through the big crowd. That debate is the one we're here talking about today. And unfortunately, the debate at the level you just saw, the discourse, is the one that America has had too often. We've not talked about this in serious ways. What you've heard from the folks who spoke before me was just that. I'm going to skip the part that talks about the threat. I think it has been identified. I think folks have talked about that, and you all, if you listen to this and trust the folks who spoke, as you should, you'll understand the threat from cyber attacks to each and every one of us. I grew up in Orange County in the 1980s. That was Reagan country. And then, as you heard, I went to West Point, And then I was elected to Congress in 2010 with the Tea Party wave. So I perfectly embody the challenges between someone who believes in peace through strength and who distrusts the federal government at an enormous level. And so we've got to figure out a way to do that. I actually think we can, and that's why I want to talk about this in a way that is different from the way that Edward Snowden did. Edward Snowden talked about this from the place of a traitor, a man who made commitments to protect American secrets that would help keep our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines around the country alive, and he violated that fundamental commitment that he made to each of us under the United States Constitution and a document that he signed. But I don't care about Mr. Snowden's politics. I care about the impact that he has had on American national security and the way we will ultimately defeat the folks who intend to harm us through cyber attack. You know, it is in some ways the same threat we have faced before, but in many ways it is different. One primary difference is that no longer are those of you in the audience today collateral damage. Right? We used to think about that, right? America fights very hard and we try and do our best to take out the bad guys and leave those folks who are trying to just leave their lives alone. Cyber terrorists are coming after you. They're coming after the folks who are just trying to live their lives and create wealth for their family and do all the things that are great about our nation, and they're coming after us. This can only be considered an act of war. If anybody broke in to Sony and stole their video, we'd have sent the FBI to investigate. Had anybody done what some of these other attacks have done to slow down our computer network and physically done that, we would have treated a nation state that behaved that way as the enemy, and we would have responded as a nation appropriately. Our president instead did one good thing. He identified North Korea as the culprit for the actions, but beyond that passed some meaningless sanctions. This will simply not be enough to deter these threats. Look, we have to stop these attacks in a way that is constitutional as well. I think we can. There was an enormous debate about the metadata program in Section 215. We're about to enter that set of debates again. I want to make sure that you know some of the facts because I think they're important for conservatives to understand. You have members of Congress telling the conservative community that the United States government is wantonly listening to your phone calls and reading your emails. It is not true. It is simply not true. What you have is mostly military folks who work at the NSA and our Department of Defense intelligence folks doing their darndest to keep you all safe. And each time I've talked to them about these programs and how we shape them and how we put these programs together in a way that protects privacy, they are at the forefront of wanting to do that. I'll tell you, they want that for two reasons, right? These folks who are charged with this want it to be done lawfully because they know two things. One is you may end up with Dianne Feinstein in charge of the United States someday. And when she is, she may well just deny she ever authorized these very programs, and you'll end up in a prison in the United States of America. They want to make sure that we have an American consensus involved in these programs and do them in a way that is legal and where they are very clear that they have authority. The second thing is they know that if they behave poorly, they know that they behave in a way that is inconsistent with the American tradition, that these tools will go away, that their capacity to keep you all safe will be diminished. And I've not met one of the warriors who ever wants to engage in a program that presents any risk that the tools that they need to make sure that we don't fight this with one cyber hand tied behind our back. They want to make sure that they do this in a way that is consistent with not only the law, but the Constitution, the statutory law, but also the Constitution and the fundamental American traditions. I'm confident we can do that. When America gets it wrong, we face multiple increased threats. So when the president goes to West Point, as he did, and this is very personal for me, when the president goes to West Point and tells a group of graduating cadets that the single biggest threat to America is global warming, our hope for denying cyber terrorists the ability to penetrate America is near zero. If instead we will all talk about the threat, we will talk about the threat from radical Islamist ideology and their war on the West and their deep desire to use this tool, this cyber tool, to attack us, we have the opportunity to actually defeat it, to push back, to engage in a way that is shaped to the law and the Constitution, and yet does this. In a post-9/11 world, it keeps us from revisiting that day, and we have to do that. Judge Mukasey knows this all too well. He was involved deeply in structuring our legal framework in the post-9/11 environment. We can't walk away from that. The threat is far greater today, in spite of what our Secretary of State said 24 hours ago. The threat is far greater today than it was 2 years ago, and even greater than it was 6 years ago when we put this man in charge of the United States of America's national security. In Congress, we have 3 or 4 tools that we can use. Senator Portman talked about a couple of them. I voted last year to make some significant changes to the Patriot Act. They were not all changes in the first instance I would have signed up for. They weren't perfect. They weren't my ideal. But what we did was we had a robust discussion, and we found a way that we could provide the information that the intelligence community said they needed in a way that was respectful of privacy rights in a way that we had not been before. I think we reduced some agility, but I think we did it in a way that we can still accomplish that mission. Senator Portman talked about information sharing. We have failed to pass that statutory framework, where knowledge that is contained in one place, sometimes within the private sector, sometimes on city and county and state and nonprofit, all of these folks are daily being attacked, and if we can get this information where we can real-time share this data, we can communicate this, we can do it wholly constitutionally, and we can reduce this threat. We can minimize the times when there's a penetration that presents Hiroshima that was talked about earlier. I know we can do these things. It will take conservatives standing up for this. We are people who deeply just want the federal government out of our way. I live that. I feel that. It is in my blood. The best way to keep the federal government out of our way is to make sure we have the tools to keep the bad guys out. The more tools we take away, the greater that the dragnet will ultimately have to be to keep us safe, because the American people will demand it. So if we get this right and we get it measured, I know we can do the first task of the United States government, which is to keep you all safe, and we can do the global task, which is keeps the federal government out of your lives to the maximum extent possible. Look forward to the questions this afternoon.
In general, I know you graciously said you wouldn't make any opening statements, but I'm going to ask you to make one anyway, just because it'll add. I know it will, regardless of what you say.
Well, as all these presentations were being made, I kept trying to think of something upbeat to say. From what I recall, when I was there, and it's now been 6 years, the fact is that we, I think, and we still are, better at this than any other country in the world or any other collection of countries in the world. And by this, I mean the kind of cyber combat that goes on up in the Wild West every day. That's not to say that we shouldn't be doing a whole lot about it, that we shouldn't be doing particularly the things that, that Senator Portman and that Mike Pompeo mentioned, which are sorely needed. The fact is that cyber is, in a sense, the Wild West. The question is who has jurisdiction? We've got cases being brought by the Federal Trade Commission. We've got cases being brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office. We've got cases being brought by DA's offices. We've got private lawsuits being brought by lawyers who will sue companies that have been hacked, claiming that they didn't protect your electronic data carefully enough. All of that going on at the same time makes for a lot of mayhem. A lot of that needs to be straightened out. And it can be straightened out legislatively by at least creating some clear lanes of authority. When necessary, providing immunity to people who need to share information. I also think that I would second the particularly Mike Pompeo's comment about how conservatives need to get on the right side of this and need to get on the right side of it quickly. I can't tell you how furious it makes me to see politicians exploiting people's fears about being eavesdropped on. There are 350 million people in this country. Anybody who thinks that the United States government is listening to all 350 million people in this country needs clinical help. It doesn't make any sense. The people who are involved in gathering intelligence have one thing that keeps them up at night, one thing that is the source of every nightmare that they ever have, and that is the possibility of another 9/11. That's what they're trying to prevent. That's what they're focused on. The programs that you've heard about, read about, were not abused, except I will tell you that the 712 program, that's the one involving listening to foreign conversations overseas by non-Americans, was abused, I believe, in 6 instances. That is, 6 times people who work on that program listened in on conversations that they shouldn't have listened in on, i.e. conversations of their significant others, and those people were punished severely for it. Other than that, there's been no documented abuse of any of that. I'll stop here.
Okay, I'm going to throw this out there before I take the first question. I spent my life as an Army Green Beret, so I'm a lot more used to being the threat than protecting against the threat, but that gives me a kind of a good view of how bad guys think, because I think more like a bad guy than a good guy sometimes. I have to tell you this, now I do cyber all the time. This is a real thing. What these gentlemen have put out here, if anything, is a very reasonable, mild description of what's out there. There's a lot of people that have a higher end view of it that get even a little crazier. It's real, it's not hype. That said, the sky is not falling. We are still really, really good at this too. The problem is this is changing constantly. It's very dynamic. We have bad guys who are very capable and very motivated and don't have to follow any rules. We're a democracy. We're a nation that goes by rule of law. Well, at least most of us that are not in too high a position of power. But, you know, and that makes it harder for the good guys to do it. Just as the general mentioned, those guys follow the rules. Now I'm going to throw this question out to you guys so you can think about it. Then I'll give instructions to the audience. And this one some of you already touched on, is can a democracy like ours achieve a balance, or are we destined to have either really poor security or really badly curtailed rights? So before anybody answers that, I'll throw out instructions. After they answer that, I'll call on folks. I just want your name and a question, all right? If I don't hear a question mark at the end of the sentence, I'm going to ask you to stop, because we got a lot of people in a very short amount of time. I'm not trying to be mean, but we don't need any speeches. We got 5 experts up here who can do the authoritative part. You guys ask the question. Can you help me with that? All right, thank you. All right, who would like to go first? The general. I have a feeling you might.
I mean, I think the short answer to your question is yes. And I think that the founders did absolutely all the balancing that's necessary in that regard. They drafted a Fourth Amendment that bars unreasonable searches. Not all searches, just unreasonable searches. They made the results of searches admissible in court only with a warrant, but that doesn't mean that that's the only kind of search that can be conducted. They understood the need for secrecy. The Constitution itself contains a provision that requires each House of Congress to publish a journal, except as to those matters that the members consider to require secrecy, and those need not be published. They did not take any particular principle, put their arms around it, and go over a cliff with it. And if we adhere to that balance and keep it in mind, there's no reason why we can't have as free a society as we have, where people's privacy is protected.
Others?
Well, I think all of us in the panel would probably agree that the big issue is not the information sharing I talked about earlier, but it's information sharing with the government, where you have a real conflict here, potentially. And it's personal information. Personally identifiable information is kind of the legislative language that we're trying to work on in some of these bills. And I guess my answer would be, yes, it's possible, but we do need some rules. And so I agree with Congressman Pompeo's thought that it would be good to have some legislation, not just because of the antitrust issue I talked about earlier, that's the sharing between entities that are getting hacked, but also to determine what is appropriate for that personal information. When should it go to a government agency? How should the government agency use it? Some of this is covered, as was noted, in previous legislation that had to do with fighting terrorism. But again, it's almost like another century has passed since then, because the attacks are so different and they are so much more sophisticated. So I do think that this is going to be a tough balance to reach, but the best way to do it, to me, is to get some rules in place that let the government know how they can use information, how they can't use it. Let private company knows what's appropriate to provide, what's not. And I think if we don't do that, again, if we just sort of sit back and allow this to happen, one, we're going to be less safe, but two, you may see some breaches. I think Attorney General Mukasey, who was very involved with this after 9/11, is correct that there have not been the problems with the 215 program that a lot of, Mike Pompeo talked about this too, that a lot of people allege. However, there is always a risk. And so I think it is important to get this legislation done. As I said, one of our problems, we have 5 committees looking at this in the United States Congress, and that does not make sense. There needs to be a consolidation of the committee jurisdictions, and there needs to be an ability to move quickly to what will be an ever-changing threat. And that's a challenge as well. But I do think we can get there, but it requires some more guidelines and some guardrails.
Kevin?
Yeah, I would throw in, as long as the rule of law is followed, we have protections in place and should add more. But my concern comes if Lois Lerner were ever put in charge or someone like her. And so there comes a point at which personnel determine this. And that's why it's very important for the executive branch to return to the rule of law, because there is a purge that has taken place in the military. There is an active effort to remove freedoms from the people, net neutrality, and all of the other issues that we see. This is going to be a war the American people must fight to protect and preserve the Constitution of the United States. And with the Constitution, I agree with General Mukasey, we are protected. We've just got to protect the Constitution.
Let me say one thing. I completely agree with that. If there had been 10% of the oversight at the IRS that there is surrounding America's intelligence collection programs, we wouldn't be having hearing tonight at 7 o'clock trying to figure out where the heck those lost emails went. It is the case that there's not only importance of the Fourth Amendment and the protection of an individual American v's government, but it is also centrally important that we have all 3 branches of government involved in these intelligence collections programs as well, just as they are under the Patriot Act, where I, as a member of the House Intelligence Committee, get reports monthly and quarterly that says these are the actions that we have engaged in. And this is what we've done. This is what you provided us resources for. Here's what the law permits. When they make a mistake, they notify us as well. And then the FISA courts also have oversight. So we have all 3 branches of government providing those checks that the founders talked about to make sure we can keep America secure. And we've got to do those things. Otherwise, we end up in a constitutional place that none of us would be happy about.
I just want to emphasize one point that I think is inherent in what the last 2 speakers said, and that is that sometimes personnel is policy. In a sense, there's no such thing as the United States government. They're just a bunch of people that work for different agencies. Some of them are honest and dedicated and really want to protect you. By and large, those people work for the NSA. And some of them are none of the above, and by and large, they work for the IRS. So it really is a matter of who's in charge. And the IRS has a long and unglamorous history of being a politicized agency. We have to make sure that agencies like that and people like that are not given access to the kind of information that can be misused.
Okay, the gentleman against the wall, he had his hand up first.
A few hours ago, the Net Neutrality Act was passed on a party line vote. None of us peons know what's in there. I'm hoping that someone here has some idea. Could you comment on the impact of what we're talking about today?
Senator Portman, do you want to try to? I'll take a quick. The FCC today took jurisdiction over the internet using what's called Title II. It's the set of laws that were passed in the 1930s to regulate the what existed at the time for the telecommunications world. They did it under the rubric, under the ruse, in my view, that they want to make sure that the American consumer doesn't get cheated by some company prioritizing something that comes to you or doesn't come to you without your permission. The truth is, this is an enormous power grab by the United States federal government, and will ultimately result in second-order effects of fees and a restricted access to what today is a pretty wide-open internet in ways that I don't think the FCC even appreciates. I saw comments. There's a Kansan on the FCC. His name was Ajit Pai. He is both a brilliant man and a good conservative, and you should read his dissenting opinion with respect to what they did today. It'll tell you all you need to know about the risk that is now upon us.
Okay. Nobody over here? All right, the gentleman with the hat, and then the gentleman with the beard, and then the lady at the end.
I was just wondering if you all could address the concern of how to work with foreign governments in this, even legitimate foreign governments for that matter, with this situation. How difficult is that been?
Well, I think that the leaks certainly haven't helped. In fact, they've made foreign governments reluctant to share their secrets with us. I mean, obviously their reaction is, if we can't protect our own information, how are we going to protect the information that we get from them? And that curtails our ability to keep the country safe. We have excellent relationships with the intelligence community in foreign countries, but that's only as good as our ability to keep our own information safe. And once that lapses or disappears, we're going to be really hard-pressed, because we'll be thrown back on our own resources and we won't have access to theirs.
I want to stress also that we need to go back to the idea of human intelligence and not just data collection. I think that's absolutely essential. General Flynn at the DIA has made the point very strongly. There was a Russian spy who was a Russian banker caught trying to crash or trying to learn how he could crash the stock exchange using exchange-traded funds and algorithmic trading. And that's why the FBI caught him and arrested him. We ought to have human intelligence around the world. It puts us in a league that we can have better relations with other countries. We've pulled back from that. And so if all they see us collecting are intercepts, the other governments are going to be disappointed or question the quality of the information. And keep in mind, as we have these protections, the bad guys, the troublesome nations and so forth, they're aware of how we collect information. They learned it from Edward Snowden, and so they're moving around that. So we need to go back to a human intelligence network to supplement and augment what the State Department does on interstate relationships. And I think that would actually improve our position and stature globally.
I couldn't agree with Kevin more, and I was in the Mideast a few years ago when I was told by one of our intel people, and this is not in a classified setting, you know, Senator, we just don't know. In this case, it was regarding what was happening in Syria, and we would have known had we had human intel, but we have pulled back, and so you find this around the world, that some of our human intel is with these countries you're talking about, sir. So these countries are providing us intel because we don't have the human intelligence anymore. They do. They provide it to us. Now they're pulling back in many instances because of their concern about us leaking, not just information, but actual specific information about sources of intelligence, which puts their human intel people obviously at great risk. And there have been some stories, that some of which are public, some of which are not, about that just is, you know, it's embarrassing. As the United States of America, that we are putting at risk those who risk their lives for us. So I think it's very important to have that. And second, I would just say, as a general matter, again, nothing that's classified, but just as a general matter, when you hear a foreign country complaining about the United States of America engaging in some of this important intel gathering to avoid things like what happened in Paris or what happened in Denmark or what happened in the Netherlands, sometimes they, what was the thing that Shakespeare said, they doth complain too much or something? They're doing it too, but they don't tell their citizens that. And we're a little more transparent, believe it or not. And so I sometimes tell my constituents, they say, well, this country's mad at us because we're gathering information on people within their country. Well, yes, and so are they. And this is helping to make the world safer, particularly with the visa waiver program we have with the Europeans. This is very important right now that we have what you identified, these partnerships, because people have the ability to come to our country without getting a visa from many of these countries where they have sent ISIS fighters. We have our own ISIS fighters over there and other terrorist groups, so we have to do a better job with this information sharing and trust, or else we're going to be more at risk here.
I mentioned something that has come up in our reporting a lot, and I think you all hear it a lot more in the next year, and that's offensive cyber warfare. And there's a lot of collaboration going on between multiple countries in developing technologies that if someone starts probing you, you can send something back through the internet pipeline and tell them stay away. And I like to call this like what happened in my neighborhood a couple years ago. Someone had their house broken in at night, and so we went and got a little 12-inch dog, but he sounds like a Siberian Husky, and he barks loud enough, no one's going to come near our house. There's a lot of great collaboration and technological development going on in the offensive sphere. When General Mukasey was at the Justice Department, there was a brilliant guy at the FBI, and his name is Sean Henry. He was the first FBI expert in cyber security, and he has really developed some extraordinary tools in the private sector to help companies ward off, make it unpleasant if you try to break into our systems. And I think that'll be a thing you're going to hear a lot more about in the next couple of years. It's going to raise some new legislative issues. It's going to raise some privacy issues, but it's going to be a place where this battle is going to be taken to next.
All right, we're running out of time. I'm going to ask the two of you to ask both your questions before anybody answers, and then we'll answer them, and then we'll...
A quick question. First of all, really appreciate the information and the expertise of sitting at the table, and that's not a speech that leads into my question is, how do I, going home, express the nuclear illustration you've given? How, in a few words or sentences, can I tell my family how important this really is?
Okay, before anybody answers, let the lady, you can ask yours as well.
So, just a quick summary. It seems to me that we have a situation where the Constitution is getting eroded and we don't have enough intelligence, and we also need to have a plan for cybersecurity. So the question is, how much can Congress do to have oversight over all of these things? Because it seems to me that Congress isn't practicing their oversight power to, bring some of these issues to.
All right, and you guys can pick.
I'll take the second
either
one.
or
I'll take the
both.
second one quickly. Look, it is the case that we've had folks talk about personnel. It's my duty. I have the authorities that I need in almost every case to perform this oversight function appropriately. When we had members of Congress say, gosh, I didn't know this was going on, that may well have been true, but it was only because they didn't do their job. That is, every member of Congress, not just those members of Congress who are on the Intelligence Committee, had the capacity to know the scope of the majority of the activities that are taking place, certainly programmatically, if not in detail about what's going on. You need to hold your elected officials accountable to make sure that oversight takes place. The second thing is, we all, when we're working on legislation, need not to picture the current occupant of the White House as the person with whom we're trying to strike an arrangement as between the executive and legislative branch. We need to imagine a time where you have a president who won't talk about radical Islamic terrorism, right? We need to imagine a time when we have a president who we have to account for what the founders did, which said we don't know exactly what this is going to look like, but we're going to share power, and we're going to make sure that there are multiple folks staring at this, and then you just have to count on the folks you send to Washington D.C. to perform that function.
Yeah, I'm going to make a point that I've already made probably too much today, but I don't think, first of all, thank goodness Mike Pompeo is where he is and that he has that background and interest and ability. I don't think there is effective oversight now because there is not effective accountability. Because when you have several committees, I mentioned 5 committees looking at cybersecurity right now, it's very easy to point the finger somewhere else. And the Intelligence Committee has its role, and that's very important. And I think most members of the Intelligence Committee take their job seriously and they spend time at it and so on. But I think there needs to be a streamlining of the responsibilities to get some more accountability so you know who you can talk to say what is happening, particularly with regard to these cyber attacks that are happening now, as I mentioned, to our critical infrastructure, where along with Kevin's lines here, what he was talking about, what could happen, and John's been talking about. But I'd like to hear John and Kevin's response to that first question.
Well, I'll share my response. We started a nonprofit training organization called National Security Investment Consultant Institute. And the reason we did that is because it all comes down to how do I protect my family, how do I protect my money? And I come from an investment advisor background, and investment advisors have a trusted relationship with their clients. So we decided we would train investment professionals, your financial planner, insurance agent, stockbroker, about the threats to national security that exist. So we had our first class at Oklahoma Wesleyan University. We brought in people like Lieutenant General Boykin, Patrick Byrne, Frank Gaffney, Governor Keating, John Lanchowski, Claire Lopez, Joe Schmitz, and others that are experts, Jenny Thomas. And we train them because I'm not certain the federal government can meet the needs. All of this, I'm a conservative private sector guy. I believe in the free market. You're worried about your money. You want an advisor who can help you protect your money. They want clients. So if they have this expertise, they're going to get more clients and do a better job. So that's our dissemination mechanism for information on how to protect you. And we apply all of the good free market principles and solutions from the top national security experts so they can tell you how to protect your bank account, what kind of stocks you invest in if this happens, how do you diversify to protect yourself, and so forth. So we did 4 days of this. We're going to do more of this in the future. But I think the free market has to get involved. You cannot rely on government. It cannot be big enough to protect everything you need protected. So we've got to go to your trusted advisor to make that happen.
All right. Well, as a guy that's in the information industry, I think the most powerful weapon you have is to stay informed. You can no longer say, you know, that technology's for my kids. If you own a cell phone, if you have a smart thermostat in your home, if you have a credit card, you're going to have the obligation to get informed about what's going on in the world. This is easily defeated if you stay on top of the information that's coming out. There's great private sector, there's great public sector things going on. We have the technology. The senator's right. We've been on the leading edge of this for a very long time, and we still are. But you have a job in this fight, and that is to stay informed and then put the proper protections in place. And if you do, we're going to all serve pretty well together in fighting this together. It isn't something government can defeat on its own. And so information, knowledge, it is power.
And I can tell you that there's a lot of people, I go all over the country talking to people about this, trying to educate folks. There's a hunger out there all across America to know what to do, you know, to be less of a victim at least, and hopefully to be part of the solution. There's a lot of folks out there willing to do that. Just reach out and you can find us and we'll try and give you a hand. But right now I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking the panel. This was a pretty rich discussion.